Hello, I'm Jen Moore, Music of the Baroque's program annotator, and thank you for joining me for Baroque Notes, Music of the Baroque series of online pre-concert talks. In this installment, I'll be discussing our April concerts, Birds, Frogs, Crickets, and Dogs. And this is exactly the kind of program I associate with our principal guest conductor, Nicholas Kramer, a funny, interesting Baroque orchestral program with a dash of Haydn thrown in for good measure. Nicholas has chosen 5 relatively short works that show off different ways the natural world finds its way into 18th century music. 2 pieces by Vivaldi, 2 works by Telemann, and 1 symphony by Haydn. In this penultimate talk of our 23-24 season, I'm going to discuss briefly how this program evokes the different ways nature was used in music and how the very nature of music itself changed in the Baroque era. They're big topics, but I'll try to keep it brief. The Baroque era is usually defined as starting in 1600 with the birth of opera and ending around 1750 with the death of Bach. While these dates are arbitrary, they do demarcate the musical landmarks that make this period important. Highlighting Bach, for example, points to the existence for the first time of a truly distinct body of music written for instruments alone. Prior to the Baroque, instrumental music consisted mainly of dance music or vocal music performed on instruments. One of the most important types of instrumental music was the concerto, a work for soloist or groups of soloist and ensemble. One of the central figures in the concerto's development was the Italian composer Antonio Vivaldi, who was born in Venice in 1678. By bringing together a soloist and an ensemble, the concerto form centers on one of the main aesthetic principles of the Baroque era, the notion of sharp contrast, in this case, between solo and ensemble. Vivaldi's concertos also tackle a problem that writing music with no words creates. In musical theater or opera, the story creates a feeling of a beginning, a middle, and an end. With a piece for instruments alone, however, how do you create the structure? Vivaldi uses a strict organizing principle called ritornello form, ritornello meaning little return, to organize the sound and create a sense of forward movement. Here, I've sketched out an example of very simple ritornello form. The strict alternation between the ensemble and the soloist form building blocks that the composer then takes through a series of keys from music that feels stable through a feeling of instability back to a point of stability, all while maintaining those alternating blocks. Vivaldi wrote hundreds of concertos, but he is most famous for the 4 grouped under the title The Four Seasons. Written around 1717, the concertos were published in 1725 in a collection entitled The Trial Between Harmony and Invention. The work was famous in Europe throughout Vivaldi's lifetime. As one critic wrote in 1740, "Who does not know the Four Seasons of Antonio Vivaldi?" Well, modern audiences didn't until the work was revived in the 1960s. In the Four Seasons, Vivaldi offers yet another way of organizing instrumental music, what's called programmatic music, or music that follows an actual story. Each concerto corresponds with a sonnet that matches a formal structure and also drives a musical content, too. It's generally assumed that Vivaldi wrote the poetry that goes along with each concerto. In merging literary and musical forms, the composer almost has the best of both worlds. Vivaldi's approach to music is relatively formal, and he takes a very literal approach when depicting his poetry, too. In fact, his 18th century Italian spring is not so different from our own 21st century Chicago spring. In the opening allegro, we know the season has arrived because birds are singing. And what silences them? As Vivaldi writes in the accompanying poem, "Festive spring has arrived. The birds salute it with their happy song, and the brooks, caressed by little zephyrs, flow with a sweet murmur. The sky is covered with a black mantle, and thunder and lightning announce a storm." Here's a visual rendering of the opening of the spring concerto, which I love for the way it shows so dramatically the difference between the solo and ensemble textures. We'll hear the bird's happy song through its silencing. Those of you who have listened to more than one of my pre-concert talks know that I love to seek out moments when classical music shows up in popular culture. Vivaldi's Four Seasons has been a real playground for me. I've managed to sneak in The Simpsons, the action movie John Wick 3, that one was great, and one of my favorites, guitarist Eddie Van Halen's classic Eruption. And I've got one for you this time, too. The Four Seasons inspired American alternative rock band Weezer, which formed in the early 90s, to create a 2022 series of 4 albums entitled Seasons. We had a little controversy in the office about how to pronounce that, but we do believe it is Seasons and not Seasons. There is some question over whether Weezer's Seasons, also fun to say, Weezer's Seasons represent 4 extended plays, 2 traditional albums, or 1 single double album. I think you'll agree, however, that there is no question about the musical source material.
One night out under the stars, one night out under the stars, with Romeo and Juliet. One night out under the stars, one night out under the stars. Have you seen this one yet? Shakespeare makes me happy, Shakespeare makes me happy, so happy, and I'm happy to be with you. Shakespeare makes me happy, Shakespeare makes me happy, so happy, and I'm happy to be with you.
The fact that Vivaldi's music is so familiar today shows just how much it captures people's imagination, and perhaps also how well this brilliant and quite literal musical illustration translates from century to century. Telemann's 2 descriptive works, the Cricket Symphony and the Frogs Concerto, both composed a few decades later, are quite different. Part of this, of course, is that Georg Philipp Telemann is a very different composer. It's always fascinated me that Telemann's contemporaries considered him to be better than his colleague and friend Johann Sebastian Bach, because today, of course, Bach is one of the great masters. Well, for many people, Telemann is still that guy who holds the record in the Guinness Book of World Records for most prolific composer. So why was the 18th century view of these 2 men so different? In his 1730 memo to the Leipzig Town Council entitled Short but Most Necessary Draft for a Well-Appointed Church Music, Bach complained about audiences' increasing penchant for cosmopolitan music. It is, anyhow, somewhat strange that German musicians are expected to be capable of performing at once and extempore all kinds of music, whether it comes from Italy or France, England or Poland. And it was actually precisely this mixture of styles, or this mixed taste, as it was called, at which Telemann excelled. Telemann's Grieg Symphony illustrates the public's interest in this mixed taste, and also maybe the composer's frustration with it too. Written sometime between 1758 and 1766, relatively late in Telemann's career, the symphony was initially titled Grieg Symphony in the Italian, French, English, Scottish, and Polish styles. This title went unused, but remained lodged in its composer's mind. While Grieg is German for cricket, the word can also connote whims, and Telemann seems to play with both possibilities throughout. In the first movement, the brightly colored winds and darkly hued double basses trade solo phrases back and forth, suggesting crickets chirping. After a slow movement called Tändelnd, literally dallying or trifling, the solo groups return in the concluding presto, a rustic dance that concludes the symphony on a humorous note. The way Telemann brings out the fun of this so-called cricket noise is wildly different from what Vivaldi does in the Four Seasons. Telemann was a great critic, apparently, of what he called the rage of ordinary symphonies, and it is easy to imagine this cricket symphony as a relatively pointed jab at people who favored this up-and-coming ordinary symphony. The violin concerto in A major equally displays Telemann's great sense of humor. It's known as Die Reilinge as the result of the inscription Reiling's solo over the solo part in the first movement. The German word for frog is actually Frosch, but as it turns out, a Reilinge is a sort of 18th century toad. Going back to Vivaldi's music, nature was a springboard for musical depiction, but he also carefully contains this within its musical form. In this concerto, Telemann uses this basic toad noise as a chance to create unusual musical sounds, but also to make fun of the musical conventions. I think the very best example of this happens right at the start, and it's just wonderfully outrageous. We hear an orchestral introduction, followed by the entrance of the soloist, but it's just on a repeated A, and then each part imitates it. In the score, you just see the words simile, simile over and over again, similar, similar, same. The effect is a frog's chorus. It's gloriously funny, and I think it's probably slightly sarcastic too. The second movement begins with a similar sort of croaking, but it quickly dissolves into absolutely gorgeous lyricism, with the croaking sort of becoming a pulsing that supports this melody. And how would a frog's concerto end? Well, with a stately minuet, of course, completely devoid of any frogs. And this again really just kind of it just made me laugh because I thought, of course, there are no frogs in the final movement of the frogs concerto. So if you hear frogs, please let me know because I tried hard. I wanted to hear the frogs. And then I thought, he's just playing with the listeners. Last, we arrive at Haydn's Symphony, a completely new world of music and a very different reason for the nature reference. First performed in 1787, Joseph Haydn's Symphony No. 83 in G minor is one of his Paris symphonies, commissioned at the end of 1784 or the beginning of 1785 by Count d'Ogny, who headed a fashionable concert series known as the Concert de la Loge Olympique, Concert of the Olympic Lodge, which was connected with the Freemasons. The orchestra of the Loge Olympique was huge for its day. It had 40 violins, 10 double basses, and double woodwinds, and its patrons included Marie Antoinette and her ladies-in-waiting. The Symphony No. 83 is perhaps the least well-known of all of the Paris symphonies, but it's so original and inventive, and for many people, it's actually their favorite. The tragic and passion G minor key makes this comic hen theme that comes in very striking. And the fact that this motive actually is what grew into the symphony's name says volumes to me. I love the way this program shows off subtleties and aesthetic shifts over the decades in the 18th century. Vivaldi almost cages his singing birds within the strict Baroque ritornello form, adding a poem for the sake of variety and drama. By the middle of the 18th century, listeners know musical form well enough that Telemann plays with expectations. A duo of solo double basses is pretty unusual in a work called a symphony. Well, a concerto soloist would almost never play a single note over and over, especially in its entering gesture. And Haydn's Symphony, though written for the French elite, arrives to us today via a bucolic nickname that might make the abstract music feel warmer and certainly more familiar. I hope what I've said will enhance your experience of birds, frogs, crickets, and dogs. And I hope you'll join us in May for the final concert of the 23-24 season, Heaven and Earth, an exploration of the dramatic power of sacred and secular Baroque music, featuring Allegri's Miserere and Handel's Dixit Dominus, which is my favorite Handel sacred work, under the direction of guest conductor Patrick Dupré Quigley, who is also wonderful. We're performing the concert twice, once in Winnetka at Saints Faith, Hope, and Charity Church, and once in our debut at Fourth Presbyterian Church downtown. There will be candles. You'll find all the details, as well as the details of our 24-25 season at Baroque.org. Thank you so much.